In ancient times, long before humanity was accustomed to the comforts of civilization, daily life presented a harsh challenge. Ancient peoples were unfamiliar with conveniences that we now take for granted, such as running water, electricity, and medicine, let alone transport and communication like cars, aeroplanes, and the internet. Everything that we, as inhabitants of the 21st century, consider an integral part of a decent existence was an unattainable dream for them. However, amidst this widespread austerity, a unique civilization emerged in the heart of the Peloponnese, ancient Sparta. Here, there existed a distinct class of citizens endowed with the full scope of political power and resources. Yet, the paradox was that they were strictly forbidden from engaging in manual labor or commerce. It might seem like an ideal life, where everything was provided and there were no worries. But before we fully embrace this idyllic image, it's worth looking behind the curtain of privilege to discover that even for the chosen Spartans, life was filled with astonishing rigor, capable of astounding the imagination. Here, we encounter the first historical inaccuracy, one that conceals many mysteries. The name, Sparta, which is familiar to us today, is not historically accurate and came into common use thanks to the Romans. One only needs to look at the legendary shield of a Spartan hoplite to see the letter lambda, emblazoned upon it. This is no coincidence, as the true self-designation of these warriors and their state was Lacedaemon, named after their city, a name, incidentally, that even experienced historians often mispronounce, placing the accent on the final syllable. The modern name, Sparta, became established much later, due to the Romans renaming the city, which led to the familiar appellation we use today. There is a common misconception that Sparta was an entirely isolated state. In reality, this is not entirely accurate, especially considering the polis existed for nearly 1,000 years, roughly from the 10th to the 1st century BCE. It is important to remember that ancient Greece was not a unified nation. It was politically fragmented, composed of numerous city-states, polis, each with its own culture, customs, and laws. Sparta was located in Laconia, in the southern part of the Peloponnese. It is from the name of this region that the expression laconic speech derives, meaning a concise and pithy utterance. This is no coincidence, as the Spartans were not fond of excessive talking. At the apex of Spartan social hierarchy were those descended from the city's first inhabitants, founded around 800 BCE. They were known as Spartiates, and this group included both men and women. However, only men held the status of full citizens and could participate in political life. Spartan women enjoyed more rights than their counterparts in other Greek city-states. They were permitted to own land and receive an education. Nevertheless, it is important to note that all known founders of city-states were men. The status of a Spartiate was not automatic. To gain such privileges, one had to prove their suitability. Every citizen was expected to be strong, athletic, cunning, and disciplined. The assessment of these criteria began in early childhood. In Sparta, newborns underwent a thorough examination by specially appointed priests and high-ranking officials. Infants with obvious physical defects or signs of unviability were sent to the foothills of Mount Taygetus, which meant certain death. It is important to note that this custom is largely part of the mythology popularized by Plutarch, the ancient Greek writer, historian, and philosopher. Before condemning the Spartans, it should be considered that similar practices existed in other cultures, both within Hellenic city-states and beyond. The reasons for such harsh practices stem from the fact that, in antiquity, caring for children with special needs was virtually impossible, and society made no provision for those unable to ensure their own survival. However, from the perspective of modern humanism, it is exceedingly difficult to accept such a practice as normal. It is important to emphasize that this measure was applied only to extremely frail infants. The presence of an illness was not a reason for expulsion from Sparta. Such individuals continued to exist, although their social status was low. There were even special military units that did not participate in battles but provided aid and support to combatants on the battlefield, performing auxiliary tasks. A widespread myth claims that weak children were thrown from the mountain cliff with cries of, "Out of Sparta!" However, Archaeological investigations at the foot of this mountain have only unearthed the remains of adults. Such a punishment was reserved for adult citizens who committed serious crimes, such as treason. Spartiates who had passed this rigorous natural selection were sent to the Agoge, a training institution, from the age of 7. The financial burden for this education fell upon the boy's family. If such means were unavailable, the boy's fate was sealed. A Spartiate who failed to achieve full citizenship status faced either public ostracism and exile, or a life marked by shame and public contempt. In ancient Sparta, the educational system, known as the Agoge, was designed to forge young Spartans into fearless and unwavering warriors, prepared to lay down their lives for their city-state. In Spartan society, the concepts of citizen and warrior were inseparable, making the defense of the state the paramount duty of every man. This is why the Agoge dedicated immense attention to intensive military training and the comprehensive development of its youths. The effectiveness of the Agoge was ensured by strict adherence to numerous rules, which might seem harsh. The primary condition for admission to the school was belonging to the Spartiate class. However, in rare instances, foreigners known as trophimoi were also accepted into the Agoge. These youths, who came from aristocratic families in other Greek city-states, represented a minor exception to the general rule. Another exception was the syntrophoi, sons of slaves adopted by Spartan families. They were granted the unique opportunity to acquire Spartan citizenship upon successful completion of their training. In the Agoge, pupils were often forbidden from communicating with their families. This isolation was believed to temper their spirit, foster moral resilience, and develop their ability to procure food, whether through cultivation or cunning. These qualities were deemed essential for a true Spartan. Alongside individual endurance, particular emphasis was placed on strengthening mutual trust among pupils, intended to create a cohesive and effective fighting unit. Young Spartans were frequently left in the wilderness to find their own way out of challenging situations. While such methods might today be perceived as cruel, in antiquity, they were considered an integral part of the training process. In Sparta, young men underwent a rigorous training system, known as the Agoge, until they reached the age of 20. Successful completion of this demanding course opened the doors to full citizenship of the polis. This status was not only the greatest honor and an exceptional privilege but also imposed immense responsibility on a Spartan toward society. Even after graduating from the Agoge, a newly minted citizen did not gain the right to live separately, continuing to refine his martial skills in barracks. This necessity might not seem so harsh, were it not for the fact that Spartan men typically married between the ages of 18 and 20, yet during their time in the barracks, they were strictly forbidden from seeing their wives. Nevertheless, this rule was not always strictly observed. Spartans, known for their cunning and resourcefulness, often secretly slipped home to their loved ones. However, this circumstance did not pose a significant problem, as Spartan citizens rarely remained in their home city. Their lives were inextricably linked with military campaigns and continuous warfare. During periods of calm between campaigns, they focused on maintaining strict control over the numerous enslaved population, to prevent any signs of disobedience. Historical sources indicate that Spartiates sometimes organized punitive expeditions against subjugated peoples. Upon returning to Sparta, they continued to live in military settlements, ceaselessly honing their combat skills until they reached the age of 30, when they were granted the right to certain privileges and the beginning of an independent life. Upon reaching this age, Spartan citizens received a land allotment, where they could finally settle with their families and lead a relatively independent existence. This land became the foundation of their prosperity. However, as the Spartiates themselves were considered the state's highest asset, they were strictly forbidden from engaging in any manual labor. Along with the land allotment, they were provided with several helots, who occupied an intermediate position between slaves and serfs. Their duties included performing all household tasks. Spartan citizens were also prohibited from engaging in commerce, whether trade or other forms of enterprise. Due to these restrictions, they relied on interaction with free members of society, known as perioikoi, who acted as intermediaries in the sale of produce grown by the helots. This system ensured them a decent livelihood and allowed them to acquire or manufacture the necessary military equipment. In antiquity, possessing vast territories and numerous slaves was considered a reliable means of acquiring wealth. However, excessive wealth was not condoned in Sparta, as Spartans strived for strictness, moderation, austerity, and asceticism. Every Spartan citizen was required to be a member of a syssitia, a unique ancient communal dining hall, and attendance at these joint meals was compulsory. Even a king could be fined for non-compliance with this rule. The most famous Spartan dish was the so-called black broth, a rich soup made from boiled pig's blood, pork, and vinegar. A modern person would likely find it challenging to appreciate the taste of this fare. Membership in a syssitia was a necessary condition for maintaining strong social bonds among Spartan citizens. Furthermore, everyone was obliged to eat in these dining halls at least once a day. Participation in such collective meals required certain contributions, not in the form of gold coins, but as material donations, primarily foodstuffs. The idea was that, since citizens ate there daily, they should proportionally contribute to the provision of these meals, a kind of principle of fair exchange. However, given the large number of participants in these communal dining halls, the cost of membership proved to be quite high. If a citizen managed their land allotments inefficiently and, consequently, could not fully supply food to other syssitia members, this threatened them with serious consequences, including the loss of citizenship. A natural question arises: what did Spartans do if they were strictly forbidden from engaging in manual labor or any trade? It is often mistakenly believed that Spartan citizens spent their days in idleness and carefree living, while the Helots performed all the arduous work for them. However, this is far from the truth. Spartan citizens were exempt from some burdensome aspects of daily life, but many other equally vital duties were imposed upon them. First and foremost, they had to ensure sufficient profitability from their land allotments to cover the numerous expenses associated with their civic status. And, of course, military activity occupied a central place in their lives. It should be remembered that Spartan citizens were, above all, professional warriors. A large part of their lives was dedicated to training in military arts in specialized schools, and another part to direct participation in battles. Thanks to their high level of training and discipline, casualties among Spartan warriors on the battlefield were relatively low. Consequently, this was not considered a serious problem for the polis. However, the situation began to change significantly from the 5th century BCE, when Sparta became embroiled in increasingly large-scale and prolonged military conflicts. An example is the period when most Greek city-states were subjected to aggression by the vast Achaemenid Empire, also known as Persia, led by the powerful kings Darius and Xerxes, which possessed incomparably greater human and material resources. Although the Persian invaders were ultimately defeated, without Sparta's decisive contribution, other Greek city-states would hardly have been able to withstand such a devastating onslaught. Thus, military service in the Spartan army was not merely a duty but the true meaning of every Spartan's life. At the very heart of Sparta, the citizens of the polis did not merely exist but actively participated in the governance of the state. Every full member of this ancient community automatically became a participant in the popular assemblies, which served as the supreme legislative body, determining the fate of the city and the entire polis. It was these assemblies that were empowered to elect members of the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, whose wisdom and experience served as a compass in political waters, as well as the Ephors, a college of 5 officials tasked with vigilantly overseeing the observance of laws. In addition to these bodies, Sparta had a unique system of diarchy, represented by 2 kings, traditionally referred to as the first Spartans. Their role in the formation and execution of Spartan legislation was decisive. Even upon reaching old age and retiring from military service, Spartan citizens remained in the city, earning the honorable title of elders. Many of these respected men held key political positions, serving as high-ranking officials. But even those who preferred a more secluded life enjoyed universal respect, especially if in their youth they had displayed bravery and achieved outstanding victories on the battlefield. It is worth emphasizing that full citizens constituted only a small fraction of Sparta's population, yet all power and wealth were concentrated in their hands. It is thanks to their written testimonies and chronicles that the well-known stories and information about Sparta have reached us. Their way of life left a mark on language, giving the world such words as Spartan, symbolizing austerity and asceticism, and laconic, meaning brevity and conciseness. However, there were other strata of the population whose histories, unfortunately, remain in the shadows. Nevertheless, it was precisely the stringent, at times extreme, conditions of Spartan citizenship, combined with exceptional privileges, that allowed Sparta to occupy a unique place among the states of the ancient world and become a powerful military power.